Dean Legge Show, the week of Georgia's game with Missouri, the biggest game of the season so far for sure. The winner of this game is going to have a pretty good crack at Atlanta, and I just don't see how Georgia loses this game and gets to Atlanta. There's too many pitfalls from here on out. Georgia's only a 3-point favorite, but they are playing on the road, and that's a relatively significant number. The only other road team in the conference that's favored this week is Auburn at Mississippi State. So that sort of tells you how important home field is, something Mark Richt talked about earlier this year. Nonetheless, Georgia's going to have to get a win here somewhere. They play four true road games. This is one of them, and but this is the most important one. I'll go through the reasons why. Obviously, Missouri has not lost in conference play. They're one of only 4 teams in the SEC that's undefeated in conference play. Now they've only played one game, but nonetheless, in the East, they're the only team without a loss, and in conference play, they're the only team without a loss. So it's a big game for Georgia. Now, I do think Georgia's better, but I don't think that guarantees that they win the game. I think we saw that in Columbia earlier this year. Speaking of which, that's sort of where Missouri rescued their season 2 weeks ago in Columbia, South Carolina at the Cockroach, and they definitely, I don't know if that was more South Carolina or Missouri. It's starting to look like it was more South Carolina crumbling, which they have perfected the art of through the years. But Missouri was there and took full advantage of it. They're coming back from a 20-7 deficit in a game that looked like it was just over. Mizzou comes back and wins and basically takes ownership of the East. Right now, they're the team that's completely in control. But them, Florida, and Georgia control their own destiny. And like I said, this is as big a game as it gets for Georgia not because Mizzou is a top 10 or 5 team or anything like that, but Missouri's not lost. I mean, they've lost one SEC regular season game in 2 seasons now. Of course, we haven't hardly played any this season as it relates to Missouri, but they lost to South Carolina at home last year in overtime, and they haven't lost this season yet. Of course, they were 7-1 last year coming into Atlanta and got beat by Auburn in a very high-scoring affair. Missouri has played better on the road than they have at home. They really blitzed Toledo pretty bad. I think it was 48 to. They scored 48 points, which was a significant margin in college football today. But I'm just trying to see here with Missouri's scores. There's a few things Missouri does pretty well. One of them is they're pretty good on special teams. They're pretty good on special teams in the return game, which is something Georgia's done a good job of defending this year, particularly punt returns. Georgia's only allowed four punt yards the entire year now. That's pretty good. But Missouri's very good at the kickoff return, very good at punt return, and I think their special teams in general are very good. Missouri's not fumbled the ball and lost it this year. I mean, you can't fault them for that. I mean, that really was that's an impressive thing 5 games into the season. So there are some very good things going on at Missouri, and then obviously they control their own destiny. And I think they would like to. I think they certainly would like to repeat as SEC East champions if they could. Now, their best home game was against Central Florida, a team that right now is 2-2, and had to hold on to beat Houston last week. So I don't know if UCF is great. UCF lost to Penn State and Missouri, and they've defeated Houston and Bethune-Cookman. With Missouri, I mean, the big thing everybody's talking about is what Indiana did to them on the road. I mean, on the ground. I mean, it was. I watched the end of that game, and I'm not saying I couldn't believe it, but it was hard to believe because, I mean, Missouri definitely has lost some guys. There's no question about that. But, I mean, gracious, Indiana ran for 220 or 30 yards on Missouri. They just ran it down their throat. What Missouri can do very well as well, they can rush the passer, and that's something Georgia's done pretty well. I mean, Georgia has actually done okay this season with the offensive line. We're talking about run game; they've done great. In the passing game, it's hard to know. I mean, I think they've taken about a sack a game, maybe, but that's not something they're doing a lot of. They played well on the offensive line, and there's going to be times in this game where Georgia's going to have to pass protect. I mean, there's times in every game where if you are a team, you have to do something that you don't do well. You have to do that, and you have to do it well, but you don't have to do it well the whole game. And I don't have any expectation that Georgia is going to be passing the ball many more than 20 to 25 times. I don't see it. I think they're going to ride or die with this run game. It looks like Brennan Douglas is going to play a little bit more this game. We'll see. But anyhow, back to Missouri. They defeated South Dakota State 38-18. Then they went on the road and beat Toledo 49-24. Excuse me. Really, their most dominant performance of the season was the home win the day Georgia and South Carolina played over Central Florida. They beat them by 4 touchdowns at home, so a good win. Played well. Then they followed that up with a loss to Central Florida. A loss to Indiana, which nobody seems to be able to figure out because IU lost the week before, I think, to Bowling Green. And then, of course, they had a comeback at South Carolina 2 weeks ago when Georgia knocked off Tennessee. So they had this past week off. They'll play Georgia, then the Gators, and then they'll host. They'll play at the Gators. They'll host Vanderbilt, and then host Kentucky. Then they go on the road for a relatively tough stretch. They play at A&M and at Tennessee. Then they host Arkansas the Friday after Thanksgiving. So they have a long way to go. They have 8 straight SEC games. I think they only have one other off date, and that's before their A&M game. So they I think have identified the 2 toughest teams in their opinion are Georgia and A&M, and they took the off weeks those weeks. So look, for Georgia, they have to run the football. They have to play well running the football. If they do that, they'll win the game. If they struggle and they're having to turn to a Hudson Mason who has struggled lately and whose confidence can't be the greatest on earth right this second, that could be trouble. And I don't think you want to see how well Hudson can recover from not playing great at Missouri, a place where it's relatively tough to play. At least it was the last time, and they can really rush the passer. It seems that's the one thing that Missouri I think does as well as anybody in the SEC. Now, defensively, Matty Mock has been good and bad for the Tigers. He has run well in the fourth quarter, opening up, passing lanes. Obviously, he had a 13-point deficit that he overcame to beat South Carolina on the road. And then, the other thing I should note about Indiana and then South Carolina, I mean, Mizzou stuffed South Carolina. They only allowed about 120 yards. They really got after Dylan Thompson. They only allowed about 120 some odd yards, something like that, against the Cox in Columbia. So now some of those yards were taken away because of sacks, but nonetheless, they really slowed them down where they just could not slow the Hoosiers down. So defensively, what Georgia has to deal with Mizzou's offense, is pretty good run game. Missouri is in the SEC. I mean, if you just look statistically, they're a little bit below average in a lot of stuff, and that is. I mean, I don't know if that matters a ton. I mean, I talked to buddies who covered Missouri this year. They don't think Missouri's that great, and they think Mighty Mock is very inconsistent. So I have only seen them play against Indiana and South Carolina, so it's hard for me to totally get a feel on it in the grand scheme of things. I mean, it is tough to know sometimes exactly what you're getting into. Now, Matty Mock is the conference's 8th best thrower. He's going about, just quick math here, He's going 56% throwing it, so he's completing fewer passes as a percentage than Hudson Mason. But he scored 14 touchdowns passing the ball. He's turned it over 4 times. He's been sacked 7 times. He's got a quarterback rating that is about the same as his percentage. So he's a little bit below halfway in the SEC. He's 9th out of 14 in rating. He is throwing for about what Georgia's allowing, about 220 some odd yards a game. So it's not like this is some crazy attack like Mizzou had last year, where they're just flying the ball all the way down the field all over the place. That's not really what's going on with Missouri right now. I think they are a good road test for Georgia. I do not think this is a game that is overwhelmingly complicated for Georgia. I mean, they're not a 7-point dog on the road. So I think that this is a game they got to win, Georgia, and this is a game that they should win, but they are going to have to go out there and show a lot of people, including me, that their mind is where it needs to be and that they do have the ability to just go out and win a game. I mean, the South Carolina game has spooked a lot of people with good reason, I think. I should add that there are a lot of statistical categories here where Hudson Mason is either right at or performing better than Matty Mock. I mean, one of them, if you look at Matty Mock, his yards per attempt is about 7, whereas Hudson's is 6.5, 6.8. So virtually the same. I mean, just to give you a gauge of what's what, a Dak Prescott, who a lot of people are considering the best quarterback right now in the conference, he's at 10 yards per attempt. Jeff Driscoll, who is not really playing well, he's at 5. So both Hudson and Matty Mock are at a little bit less than halfway between those two. So I don't think you're dealing with a quarterback who necessarily is going to kill you. But Georgia does have to be wary of Matty Mock's legs. If they let him get out of the pocket, he'll hurt them. A couple years ago, Todd Grantham kept James Franklin in the pocket. And for a lot of the game, Mizzou was completing a lot of passes. But then over time, Georgia started taking away some things. Now and then Jarvis Jones started getting after him. Now Georgia's got a pass rush too. But I do wonder if they just want to keep Matty Mock in there. The other thing that kind of struck me this week at the Mark Richt press conference was that, Mark said that Missouri really likes to force you to check down into throws that are, they don't want anything going over their heads. Well, no defense wants that. But he was basically saying that, they want the quarterback to throw and hit their underneath guys, hit their running backs. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like what Georgia's offense has been this season? So I think really that Georgia has gotten into, they're getting into a couple of games here where they do really, in terms of matchups, if matchups make boxing matches, Georgia's getting into a situation here where they do match up pretty well with who they're about to play, and that includes Mizzou. Missouri, if they're going to make you check down, Hudson Mason has done a pretty good job of that. He's played sketchy these last 2 games, but that is Georgia's offense with Hudson. Georgia can run on Missouri, I feel like. And Missouri's allowing about 140 yards a game. I want to double check that with the statistics here. But it is something like that currently. I mean, so it's not unbelievable. They're not Ole Miss or Bama in terms of shutting down the run game. And so that's important to remember as well. Now, they did slow down South Carolina. But and then they have a very good linebacker who's leading the conference with 50 tackles, and that's Michael Shearer. He really has played well for Missouri this season. And then, of course, Shane Ray is leading the conference with 8 sacks in 5 games. That is crazy. And if that's not bad enough, Marcus Golden on the other side has got 4. So they have 2 of the top 3 pass rushers in the conference. So look out on 3rd and 7 or worse, because that's something that Missouri is going to be able to really attack Georgia at. Now, Mike Bobo said Tuesday night, hey, Georgia's going to get sacked. That's going to happen. What we got to do is just take it from there. And he's right. Now, the other thing is, offensively, Bud Sasser for Mizzou has really performed well. He's about 450 yards, so he's a little less than 100 yards a game for Mizzou. But Georgia does, though, match up okay with these guys. I think that's the thing to keep in mind. They have a pretty good running back in Russell Hansborough. I think the real issue here is that, Georgia people still, they can't, Missouri's as far away as Nebraska is, basically. Obviously not that, but, you're talking about Iowa, Nebraska, Illinois, all these places. Georgia people don't really keep up with Missouri, so there's a lot of ignorance, really, in what Georgia's about to get into, but, I think they match up well, but again, my point is they have to go prove it. And that is something that they, there's some skepticism there. I think, as my cat wants to come in and clean her claws, there's some skepticism there because, of the South Carolina game. I think there'd be a lot more optimism or arrogance, whichever you want to call it right now, in the Georgia program if they had taken care of Tennessee the way that people would have wanted, and if they would really thrash Vanderbilt, which they did, but they didn't cover the line. And a lot of people really do pay attention to, do they cover the line, and that's the expectation. I think you just want to kind of win and take it from there. But, my take is, as a 3-point, Georgia favorite there, that's probably about right. And that number came out, and it basically has not moved the entire week. The over-under is 30. So Las Vegas is basically saying that Georgia's going to win this game about 31-28, something like that, somewhere in the ballpark, maybe 31.5 to 28, 28.5. So you get the point. It will probably come down to the last series of the game, and that means Georgia may have to stop Missouri to win. Now, the defense has played well at times. They have made possible game-winning plays against Tennessee, Vanderbilt, and they set Georgia up against South Carolina. They did not have the opportunity to do it against Clemson and Troy, and those are the 5 games Georgia's played. Obviously the Vandy game in the third quarter, Devin Bowman's return for a touchdown off an interception, that was a huge play, and that won Georgia that game. South Carolina, Damian Swann sets Georgia up on the 4-yard line. Obviously, they get no points, which will probably never happen again in the history of the world. And then against Tennessee, Josh Dawson scoring in the touchdown. So this defense is not great, but they're scoring points or they're setting up points, what should be points. You can't really ask for much more from a defense unless they're throwing a shutout. So I think that's a big part of this game is let's just see what Georgia's defense has got. Playing on the road is not great, but this is the last place Georgia will play that will be super, super loud. Kentucky will be that way too, but Missouri has all sorts of momentum. Let's see what happens when Kentucky has a couple more losses and see where the Commonwealth is there. Then next week when Georgia plays at Little Rock, that stadium only holds about 50-some-odd thousand people, so it's not really that very big. It's smaller than Georgia Tech. I think the only thing I would say too is that when you play on the road, the biggest thing is you do not have the advantage of the you do not have the advantage. Come here, Penny. Yeah. You do not have the advantage on the offensive line that you normally would. That's the issue, is that you don't have the signals. You can't, Hudson Mason going to be drawing anybody offside or anything like that because the crowd's going to be too loud. And so you don't have that get off that you normally would have. And you have to wonder if that makes a difference. Now at South Carolina, as relatively loud as South Carolina is, it didn't make a difference as it turns out. They scored 5 touchdowns and probably should have scored 6. But, that is the one thing to be concerned about. Mark Richt cut off interviews this week on Wednesday, which is, I don't know. Georgia makes so many kids available. But Jeremy Pruitt hasn't been available for a couple of weeks for whatever reason. But as far as the kids are concerned, they make so many kids available. I don't know if that's a huge deal. But Mark basically said, y'all ask for the same guys all the time. So a lot of people are going to read into that Georgia's trying to kind of shut it down and get concentrated on the Mizzou game. I think there is some of that, and I think that that's probably not a dumb decision because they know at Buttsmere what we know, which is that this is the critical game of the season. And if Georgia wins this game, the Florida game will be the critical game of the season. And that those games are huge. I never would have thought 4 years ago that I would be saying that Georgia's game with Missouri is the biggest conference game that they have. But right as we sit right now, it is. And I think that is the big thing. Missouri's gone through a lot of transition. They lost a lot of skilled players. Green Beckham's gone. James Franklin's gone. I think the kid's last name was Josie, the running back. He's gone. Michael Sam made a lot of plays for them. Their defensive front last year made plenty of plays. Their defensive front is still pretty good. But their offense has struggled. And I'll leave you with this. That last year through 5 games, Mizzou scored 40 points or more in all but one game. This year, they've only scored over 40 points, I believe, one time, and that was against Central Florida. That was against Toledo. They've scored 38, 49, 38, 27, and 21. You do have to wonder, they've played 2 Big 5 or Power 5 conference teams. They have yet to score over 30 points. Is it possible Missouri is struggling to score a little bit more than they were last year? I think the answer to that is yes, and I think we'll see. If Georgia holds them to less than 30 points, Georgia will win this game. But that's a big but. So, all right, Dean Legge Show. Penny, are you going to come say hello to everybody? Nope. Taking a bath. All right, Dean Legge Show for the week of Georgia's game with Missouri. I want to make them see you, though. Anyway, Penny. Get it, girl.